Still living in the past, I see.
Aaron thought 10 years was enough time to make two strangers out of two people who had once shared a last name. Then he saw Cynthia standing across the ballroom at Greenville High's 20th reunion, holding the same worn brown notebook she'd carried since she was 17. Some things, apparently, refused to stay in the past. Before he could decide whether to walk over, Lisa Whitmore smiled and nudged his shoulder. "So," she said loudly enough for the nearby classmates to hear, "do you ever regret letting the smartest girl in school get away?" A few people laughed. Aaron smiled too. He didn't want the reunion to become awkward. "You all remember Cynthia," he said. "She honestly believed one more notebook could solve every problem in America." More laughter. He shrugged. "I used to tell her she'd run out of pages long before she changed the world." The laughter lasted only a few seconds. Then something strange happened. Nobody added another joke. Nobody changed the subject. Several classmates looked at Cynthia instead of Aaron. Even Mr. Bennett lowered his coffee cup without saying a word. Cynthia could have corrected him. She could have embarrassed him. She could have told everyone exactly how wrong he was. Instead, she simply smiled with a kindness Aaron didn't understand. "I hope life has been good to you, Aaron," she said quietly. "I'm glad you're here." That should have ended the moment. Instead, it was the beginning of the longest evening of Aaron's life. Because before the reunion was over, he would discover that the greatest mistake he'd ever made wasn't divorcing Cynthia. It was believing he had understood the woman he'd married. "Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family." Aaron stood alone for a few seconds after the laughter died. The ballroom hadn't changed much since Greenville High's 100th anniversary banquet years ago. The hardwood floor had been refinished. The photographs on the walls were newer. Someone had replaced the old chandeliers. Everything else still carried the feeling of a place where people returned to remember who they used to be. Only Aaron couldn't stop thinking about the look Cynthia had given him. She hadn't looked hurt. She hadn't looked angry. She'd looked disappointed, not in his joke, in him. That bothered him more than he cared to admit. Mark Henderson walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd need this." Aaron accepted one. "Thanks." Mark watched Cynthia across the room. "Well," Aaron sighed. "I know. No." Mark shook his head. "I don't think you do." Aaron gave a tired smile. "You're going to tell me I shouldn't have made the joke." "I'm going to tell you." Mark paused. "That nobody stopped laughing because it was offensive." Aaron frowned. "Then why?" Mark looked toward Cynthia. "Because it sounded like you were still talking about the girl she used to be." Aaron looked across the ballroom. Cynthia was helping the reunion volunteers straighten folded programs on one of the tables. Nobody had asked her. She simply noticed they needed help. She'd always been like that, quietly fixing little things before anyone realized they needed fixing. Aaron found himself smiling. "I forgot she did that." "No." Mark looked at him carefully. "You stopped noticing." The words stung because they felt true. Before Aaron could answer, applause broke out near the front of the ballroom. Mr. Harold Bennett had just arrived. The retired economics teacher looked older. His hair was completely white now, his shoulders slightly bent. But his smile hadn't changed. Students, former students now, surrounded him almost immediately. Some hugged him, some shook his hand, others simply thanked him. Mr. Bennett laughed with every one of them as though no time had passed. Then his eyes found Cynthia. His smile softened. "Cynthia." She walked over and hugged him, not politely, like family. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. "I wouldn't have missed this." His eyes dropped to the worn leather notebook tucked beneath her arm. "You still carry it." "I still need it." He laughed. "I suppose that's my fault." "Mostly." Aaron couldn't hear the rest. The room had become noisy again. Someone called Mr. Bennett over for a photograph. Someone else wanted him to sign an old yearbook. The conversation disappeared into the crowd. Aaron kept staring at the notebook. The same brown leather cover, the same worn corners. 20 years. She'd carried it for 20 years. 23 years earlier. The first time Erin noticed the notebook wasn't in class. It was after school. Most students hurried toward the parking lot. Cynthia sat alone beneath the old oak tree outside the economics building. The notebook rested across her knees. She wasn't writing. She was staring at a page as though waiting for the right question to appear. Erin walked over carrying 2 bottles of orange soda. "You missed the bus." She looked up and smiled. "I know. You need a ride?" "In a minute." He sat beside her. "What are you thinking about?" Instead of answering, she turned the notebook toward him. Across the top of the page she'd written one sentence. "What problem do people stop seeing because they've lived with it too long?" Erin read it twice, then laughed quietly. "I don't think like you." "I know. Doesn't that bother you?" She smiled. "No. It helps me." He frowned. "How?" "You build things." She tapped the notebook. "I question them." She looked back at the page. "I've always thought the world needs both." Erin leaned back against the tree. "I don't completely understand your questions." "You don't have to." She smiled. "You just have to keep asking yours." A burst of laughter pulled Erin back to the reunion. Someone had convinced Mr. Bennett to recreate an old class photograph. As everyone gathered around him, Erin noticed something else. Mr. Bennett wasn't watching the camera. He was watching Cynthia, not proudly, not curiously, almost protectively. And for reasons Erin couldn't explain, that unsettled him. Because it suddenly occurred to him that his old teacher might know something about Cynthia's last 10 years. Something everyone else in that ballroom, including Erin, had never been told. The photographer finally managed to gather everyone into place. "Short people in front," he called. "Tall people in the back." Someone laughed. "We've been hearing that since freshman year." The room settled into familiar chaos. People shifted chairs. Friends pulled one another closer. Someone insisted Mr. Bennett stand in the middle. Erin found himself only a few feet from Cynthia. Neither of them had planned it. Neither of them moved. "Smile," the photographer said. The flash went off. For a second, Erin caught Cynthia glancing toward the old trophy case across the ballroom. Not at the camera. At the school itself. As if she wasn't remembering graduation. She was remembering something much smaller. Something only she could see. The photographer lowered his camera. "I'll have prints ready before the night's over." People scattered again. Erin stayed where he was. His eyes followed Cynthia as she wandered toward a display of old debate trophies. She smiled when she found one with a small brass plaque. Mark walked beside him. "You know what always amazed me?" Erin looked over. "What?" "You two never tried to impress each other." Erin smiled. "I don't know about that." "I'm serious." Mark pointed toward Cynthia. "Most couples in high school wanted everybody to see they were in love. You two acted like you forgot everyone else existed." Erin laughed. "We weren't that bad. You were worse." "How?" "I'd walk into the cafeteria." Mark grinned. "And you'd be arguing about whether hospitals should be designed differently." Erin rubbed his forehead. "That sounds like us." "It does." 22 years earlier. The cafeteria was nearly empty after school. Erin arrived, balancing 2 trays of fries. Cynthia already had the notebook open. He sat down across from her. "I knew I'd find you here." She looked up. "You always do." He pointed at the notebook. "Big question today." "The biggest one this week." She turned it toward him. At the top of the page she'd written, "Why do people accept waiting as normal when waiting sometimes costs lives?" Erin read it, then looked back at her. "You've been thinking about hospitals again?" "I have." "What made you think of that?" "My grandmother waited almost 8 hours in an emergency room last month." Erin frowned. "I didn't know that." "I didn't tell many people." He reached across the table and closed the notebook gently. "I'm sorry." She smiled. "It turned out okay. But it shouldn't depend on turning out okay." Erin nodded. "No." She leaned forward. "I don't know how yet. But I want to help fix things like that someday." Aaron didn't laugh. He didn't tell her it was impossible. He simply asked, "What would that look like?" She smiled. "I have absolutely no idea." They both laughed. Then Aaron picked up her pen. On the bottom corner of the page he wrote, "Ask better questions." She looked down at it. "I like that. You can keep it." "I was planning to." The reunion came rushing back as someone called for dessert. Aaron looked toward the trophy case again. Cynthia was no longer there. She had crossed the room to help one of the reunion volunteers reconnect a projector that had stopped working. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't in charge. She simply noticed someone struggling. 3 minutes later, the projector was working again. The volunteer thanked her. Cynthia smiled. "It just needed someone to unplug it first." The volunteer laughed. "I should have thought of that." "It happens." Aaron watched the exchange. It wasn't important. Not really. But it reminded him of something he hadn't thought about in years. Whenever something stopped working, Cynthia never started by blaming people. She started by asking what everyone else had overlooked. Mr. Bennett quietly appeared beside Aaron again. "She still does that." Aaron looked at him. "Does what?" "She notices problems before people notice their problems." The teacher smiled faintly. "She always did." Aaron nodded slowly. "I used to think she'd outgrow that." Mr. Bennett's expression changed just enough for Aaron to notice. "No." He looked across the ballroom toward Cynthia. "She built her life around it." Before Aaron could ask what he meant, the reunion coordinator stepped back to the microphone. "Everyone." She smiled. "We're about to begin the memory circle." She looked around the room. "And I already know exactly whose story I'm asking for first." Aaron felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. Because the coordinator wasn't looking at Cynthia. She was looking directly at him. The reunion coordinator smiled as she adjusted the microphone. "Every reunion has one story that everybody remembers differently." Laughter rolled through the ballroom. "So tonight," she continued, "we're going to settle a few debates." Someone called out, "Good luck with that." More laughter. She looked around the room before smiling toward Aaron. "Let's start with the couple every teacher thought would last forever." The room erupted in applause. Aaron rubbed the back of his neck. "I walked right into that." "You absolutely did," Mark muttered. The coordinator laughed. "Aaron." She pointed toward him. "What was the first thing that made you fall for Cynthia?" The room became surprisingly quiet. Aaron looked across at Cynthia. She wasn't watching him. She was absent-mindedly running her thumb along the worn edge of the notebook, just like she used to. He smiled. "Honestly," the room nodded. "It wasn't love at first sight." Several classmates laughed. "She intimidated me." That earned a bigger laugh. Aaron shrugged. "The first conversation we ever had lasted almost an hour, and I understood maybe half of what she was talking about." Even Cynthia laughed. The room relaxed. Aaron continued, "But she had this habit. She'd ask one question, and suddenly everybody around her started thinking differently." Lisa smiled. "That sounds exactly like Cynthia." "It is." Aaron nodded. She honestly believed every problem had an answer if people were willing to keep asking better questions. Several classmates nodded in agreement. Then Aaron laughed. "I used to tease her that one day she'd run out of notebooks before she ran out of questions." The room laughed warmly. He smiled. "And after that?" He gave a playful shrug. "I figured she'd eventually realize changing the whole world wasn't a real career plan." A few people chuckled. Then, nothing. The laughter simply stopped. Not dramatically, just quietly. Aaron noticed Lisa looking down at her hands. Daniel cleared his throat. Mark slowly took a sip of coffee. Even the reunion coordinator looked uncomfortable. Aaron frowned. "What?" Nobody answered. He looked toward Cynthia. She had finally lifted her eyes. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She simply looked at him with a quiet expression he couldn't understand. Then she smiled. Not politely, not sadly, almost gratefully. "I used to wonder if you'd remember saying that." Her voice was calm. Aaron blinked. What? The notebook part. He gave a small laugh. Of course I remember. She nodded. I hoped you would. Nothing else. She didn't defend herself. She didn't correct him. She didn't mention her life. She simply closed the notebook. Aaron felt strangely unsettled. He had expected irritation. Instead, she looked like someone who had just confirmed something she'd quietly suspected for years. Before anyone could fill the silence, Mr. Bennett stepped forward. He wasn't looking at Cynthia. He was looking at Aaron. I have a question. Aaron smiled. That sounds dangerous. It probably is. The old teacher folded his hands. When was the last time? He paused just long enough for the room to become completely still. You asked Cynthia what she had been doing these past 10 years. Aaron opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He searched his memory. Holiday cards? No. Mutual friends? No. Social media? She barely used it. The truth landed harder than he expected. He hadn't asked. Not once. He had spent 10 years assuming he already knew the answer. Mr. Bennett nodded gently. I thought so. No accusation, no lecture, just disappointment. At that exact moment, the ballroom pianist began playing an old song from their senior prom. Several couples laughed and wandered toward the dance floor. The reunion moved on. Everyone else seemed relieved that the awkward moment had passed. Everyone except Aaron, because for the first time since walking into Greenville High, he realized something deeply uncomfortable. He hadn't made the joke because he still knew Cynthia. He'd made it because he'd never stopped talking about the version of her that existed 20 years ago. And somewhere across the ballroom, Cynthia quietly watched old classmates dance, holding the same notebook, while carrying a life Aaron had never once been curious enough to ask about. The music from senior prom filled the ballroom. Someone convinced Mr. Bennett to dance. He refused at first. Then Mrs. Carter, the retired librarian, smiled and held out her hand. You still owe me one dance from the faculty Christmas party. The room erupted with laughter. Mr. Bennett surrendered. I've been outnumbered for 40 years. More laughter followed as the two elderly educators slowly crossed the dance floor. Aaron found himself smiling. So they're still like that, he said. Mark nodded. They always will be. The room relaxed again. The awkwardness from Aaron's joke slowly dissolved into old stories and familiar music. Only Aaron couldn't let it go. He watched Cynthia standing near one of the display tables. She wasn't dancing. She was helping two classmates identify people in an old panoramic graduation photograph. No. She laughed softly. That's Coach Simmons. The mustache threw me off. It usually did. The group laughed. Aaron noticed something strange. She never once mentioned herself. Whenever someone asked where she'd been living, she redirected the conversation. Whenever someone asked what she'd been doing, she answered in one sentence before asking about their children, their parents, or their jobs. It wasn't avoidance, exactly. It was practice, as though she'd spent years learning how to disappear from conversations about herself. Mark followed Aaron's eyes. You see it now? What? She asks everybody questions. Aaron nodded. She always did. No. Mark looked at him. She still does. Aaron frowned. I don't understand. Mark took a slow sip of coffee. You've been in this room almost an hour. Aaron nodded. How much do you know about Cynthia's last 10 years? Aaron opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He thought about it. He knew she'd moved away. He knew she'd worked in healthcare. He knew. That was it. Mark smiled sadly. Now, ask yourself something. Aaron looked over. How much does she already know about everybody else in this room? Aaron watched Cynthia congratulate a classmate whose daughter had just graduated from nursing school. She remembered the daughter's name. She remembered she'd wanted to become a pediatric nurse. She even remembered the scholarship she'd applied for years earlier. Aaron blinked. How did she know that? 20 years earlier. Friday nights usually ended the same way. Aaron drove. Cynthia held the notebook. They parked beside the Reedy River after grabbing milkshakes from a small diner downtown. Aaron leaned back against the hood of his truck. You've been quiet. She smiled. I've been thinking. Dangerous. It usually is. She opened the notebook. Can I ask you something? You never wait for permission. She laughed. No, I don't. Then she became serious. What do you think makes someone feel heard? Aaron didn't answer immediately. He looked across the river. Finally he said, when they don't have to repeat themselves. She stared at him for a moment, then wrote the sentence down. What? He smiled. You liked that answer. I did. You don't usually write things that fast. She closed the notebook. I think people spend too much time trying to be understood. She looked at him. And not enough time making other people feel understood. Aaron thought about that. So, listening is harder than talking? She smiled, much harder. Without realizing it, neither of them noticed the irony. Years later, both would remember that evening. Neither would remember that sentence. The applause inside the ballroom pulled Aaron back. Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Carter had finished dancing. People clapped. Someone jokingly asked for another song. The old teacher laughed and escaped back to his chair. Aaron looked toward Cynthia again. She had wandered over to Mrs. Carter. The elderly librarian reached into her purse and handed Cynthia a folded envelope. Aaron couldn't hear what was said. He only saw Mrs. Carter gently pat Cynthia's hand. Cynthia looked down at the envelope, then quietly slipped it inside the notebook. No explanation, no announcement, just another moment that seemed ordinary, until Aaron realized something. Tonight wasn't making him remember Cynthia. It was making him realize how much of her he'd stopped noticing long before the divorce. And for the first time, he wondered whether losing their marriage had started years before either of them admitted something was wrong. Aaron picked up another cup of coffee he didn't really want. It was something to do with his hands. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this unsettled without anyone raising their voice. Across the ballroom, Cynthia had become part of 3 different conversations in less than 10 minutes. She listened. She laughed. She asked questions. Then she quietly moved on, never staying long enough to become the center of attention. It struck Aaron that she hadn't talked about herself all evening. Not once. Lisa walked over carrying 2 slices of pie. She offered him one. You look like you're trying to solve a math problem. Aaron accepted the plate. I think I'm trying to remember my marriage. Lisa smiled sadly. Memory's funny. What do you mean? You don't remember life. She looked across the ballroom. You remember the parts your heart keeps replaying. Aaron stared at her. When did you get so wise? She laughed. My 3rd divorce. That caught him off guard. He laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh he'd had all night. Then Lisa became serious. Can I ask you something? Shoot. When Cynthia got excited about one of her ideas. She paused. What did you usually do? Aaron frowned. I listened. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Did you? The question stayed with him. 7 years into their marriage, Aaron walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of construction blueprints. Sin? I'm in here. She was sitting at the dining room table. The notebook lay open. Colored sticky notes covered 3 county maps. She looked up with a smile. I think I figured something out. Aaron kissed her forehead. That's good. No. She laughed. I mean, I really think I figured something out. He glanced at the maps. What am I looking at? If hospitals could share emergency inventory in real time. Oh, she pointed from one county to another. Patients wouldn't have to wait while people made 20 phone calls. Aaron nodded politely. Makes sense. She smiled. No, look. She leaned closer. If Hospital A has extra blood units, and Hospital B is running out, the system could see it immediately. Aaron looked at the clock. I'm sorry. She stopped. What? I've got to finish tomorrow's bid. The smile faded only slightly. Oh. He squeezed her shoulder. Tell me after dinner. Sure. Dinner came. A client called, then another. By the time Aaron came upstairs, the notebook was closed. The maps were gone. The kitchen lights were off. He stood there for a second, before quietly heading to bed. He never realized she had waited almost 2 hours. Back at the reunion, Aaron slowly lowered his coffee. The memory felt painfully ordinary. There had been no argument, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a postponed conversation. How many had there been? 5? 20? 100? He honestly didn't know. Across the room, Daniel was speaking with Cynthia. Aaron noticed Daniel doing something he himself hadn't done in years. He asked a question. Then he listened without interrupting. Cynthia smiled. She answered. Daniel asked another. 5 minutes later, they were both laughing. Aaron watched from a distance. It wasn't jealousy. It was recognition. She still lit up when someone became genuinely curious. Mark appeared beside him again. You figured something out. Aaron nodded slowly. I used to think we stopped talking. And? I think. He hesitated. We stopped finishing conversations. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. At that moment, Mrs. Carter wheeled herself toward the microphone. I know this wasn't on the schedule. The room turned toward her. But there's something I'd like to give back tonight. She reached into her purse, then smiled at Cynthia. I've been keeping this long enough. The entire ballroom looked toward Cynthia. Aaron frowned. Keeping what? Mrs. Carter held up a small folded piece of paper. It belongs to you. Cynthia's expression changed for the first time that evening. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. She stood slowly. Aaron had no idea what Mrs. Carter was holding, but whatever it was, it had survived 10 years. And somehow, he already knew it was connected to the notebook. Mrs. Carter held the folded paper carefully, almost as if it might fall apart. The ballroom grew quiet. I've been carrying this for a long time, she said. A few classmates exchanged curious looks. Mrs. Carter smiled at Cynthia. You asked me to keep it until you were sure you didn't need it anymore. Cynthia let out a slow breath. I remember. I don't think you do. The older woman smiled kindly. I don't think either of you remembered. Aaron frowned. Either of you? Mrs. Carter looked toward him. It belongs to both of you. The room became completely still. She held out the folded paper. Cynthia hesitated before accepting it. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were worn from being opened and folded again. Aaron had never seen it before. What is it? Lisa asked softly. Cynthia looked down at the paper for a long moment. Then she smiled, almost embarrassed. A letter. You wrote it? Daniel asked. She nodded. I never mailed it. Aaron felt his stomach tighten. When? She looked up. The week after we separated. Silence. Nobody interrupted. Mrs. Carter spoke gently. She came to the library almost every afternoon that week. Aaron looked surprised. The library? Mrs. Carter nodded. She'd sit at the same table by the window, the one where she used to study in high school. Cynthia laughed quietly. I guess old habits really don't disappear. Mrs. Carter smiled. Every day you'd write another version, and every day you'd tear it up. The room was silent again. Aaron couldn't take his eyes off the folded paper. You kept one? He asked. Mrs. Carter nodded. She asked me to. Cynthia smiled at the older woman. I told her if I came back for it, I'd send it. And if you didn't? Mrs. Carter answered. I'd keep it until life decided what to do with it. Aaron swallowed. Life had apparently decided tonight. 10 years earlier, the Greenville Public Library was almost empty. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Cynthia sat alone at the same wooden table she'd used throughout high school. The notebook lay open beside a blank sheet of stationery. She stared at it for nearly 20 minutes before writing the first sentence. She stopped, crossed it out, started again. Mrs. Carter approached quietly. Writer's block? Cynthia smiled without looking up. I don't know how to write to someone who thinks I'm leaving because I stopped loving him. Mrs. Carter pulled out the chair across from her. Is that why you're leaving? No. Then why are you? Cynthia looked down at the unfinished letter. Because I don't think he believes in me anymore. Mrs. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Did he tell you that?" Cynthia hesitated. "No. What did he tell you?" Cynthia quietly repeated the sentence she'd been carrying in her heart. Mrs. Carter listened carefully. When she finished, the librarian asked only one question. "Did you ask him what he meant?" Cynthia looked at the blank page. "No." Mrs. Carter nodded sadly. "Then perhaps this letter isn't finished yet." Back at the reunion, Aaron could barely breathe. The room had become so quiet that the soft music from another ballroom down the hall drifted into the silence. He looked at Cynthia. "Did you ever?" His voice caught. "Did you ever want me to read it?" She smiled gently. "Every day." "Then why didn't you send it?" She looked at the notebook. "Because every version ended with the same sentence." "What sentence?" She unfolded the paper, not to read the whole letter, just the last line. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If I'm wrong about what I heard, please come find me." Aaron closed his eyes. A sharp ache settled in his chest. 10 years, 10 years, and he had never known that letter existed. Cynthia carefully folded it again. "I kept waiting." Aaron looked at her. "For how long?" She answered honestly. "Long enough that I finally stopped checking the mailbox." No one in the ballroom spoke, because in that moment, the divorce no longer felt like two people who had stopped loving each other. It felt like two people standing on opposite sides of the same closed door, each waiting for the other to knock first. And Aaron realized something that hurt more than any memory from the past. The most important words Cynthia had ever written to him were the only ones he had never been given the chance to read. No one reached for dessert. The letter remained folded in Cynthia's hands. Aaron couldn't stop looking at it. He kept thinking the same impossible thought. 10 years. She wrote to me. And I never knew. The reunion coordinator quietly stepped away from the microphone. Nobody complained. For the first time that evening, the reunion had stopped feeling like an event. It felt like witnesses had accidentally wandered into someone else's unfinished story. Mr. Bennett slowly stood. "I think." He looked around the room. "Everyone deserves a short break." People nodded. Some wandered toward the coffee station. Others stayed exactly where they were. Nobody wanted to lose whatever was happening. Aaron finally crossed the room. Not quickly, not dramatically. He stopped a respectful distance from Cynthia. "I didn't know." She nodded. "I know. I would have read it." "I believe you." He looked genuinely confused. "If you believe that." "Why didn't you call me?" She smiled sadly. "For the same reason you didn't call me." Aaron frowned. "I thought you were done." "I thought you were." Silence. Neither of them argued, because neither of them could honestly say the other was wrong. 10 years earlier, the divorce papers sat untouched on the dining room table. Aaron walked past them every morning, every evening. Neither of them mentioned them. It became a strange routine. Coffee, work, dinner, silence. One Thursday night, Cynthia looked up from the notebook. "Aaron?" "Do you think people can hear completely different conversations? Even when they're sitting in the same room?" Aaron smiled tiredly. "That sounds like another notebook question." "It is." He looked at another construction estimate. "I don't know." "I think they can." He nodded absent-mindedly. "Probably." She waited. He never looked up. A few minutes later, she quietly closed the notebook. "I'm going upstairs." "Okay." He didn't notice she had been trying to start a conversation. She didn't notice he'd already spent 14 hours worrying about whether he would have to lay off 3 employees the next month. Neither of them was ignoring the other. They were simply carrying different burdens. Neither knew how to say it. Back at the reunion, Aaron rubbed his forehead. "I've remembered our divorce as one big fight." Cynthia looked at him. "We barely fought." "I know." He laughed bitterly. "That's what's bothering me." She nodded. "I used to think the same thing." Mr. Bennett quietly walked over. "I've listened to both of you tonight." Neither interrupted. The old teacher smiled gently. "You know what I hear?" Aaron shook his head. "Two good people." who kept answering questions the other person never asked. No one spoke, because there was nothing to argue with. Lisa quietly whispered, "That might be the saddest thing I've ever heard." Mr. Bennett looked toward the ballroom windows. "No, the saddest thing," he paused, "is how common it is." The room became still again. Daniel reached over and squeezed his wife's hand. Across the room, someone quietly wiped away tears. Nobody was thinking about billionaires, or success, or careers. They were thinking about conversations they'd left unfinished. Aaron looked back at Cynthia. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "When did you start believing I didn't believe in you?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly opened the notebook. Not to the letter, not to a business plan, not to a map. She turned to a page filled with handwritten dates, small notes, tiny observations, nothing dramatic, just ordinary moments. She rested her finger beside one entry, then looked back at Aaron. It wasn't one sentence. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was this. Aaron stepped a little closer. He couldn't see what she'd written. Not yet. But something told him. The truth about their marriage had never been hidden inside one terrible conversation. It had been quietly collecting itself, one ordinary day at a time. Aaron stepped closer. Not close enough to invade her space. Just close enough to see the page. The notebook wasn't filled with dramatic journal entries. There were no angry paragraphs, no accusations, no pages blaming Aaron. Instead, each line began with a date. Nothing more. Aaron frowned. "What's this?" Cynthia looked down at the page. "I stopped writing my feelings." "What did you write?" "The conversations we almost had." The room became quiet again. She ran her finger to the first entry. April 14th. Aaron came home tired. "I told myself tomorrow would be better." She moved to the next. May 2nd. He asked if dinner was ready. I wanted him to ask why I was smiling. Aaron closed his eyes. She continued. June 11th. I almost told him about the hospital meeting. He answered a phone call first. No one moved. The notebook wasn't documenting arguments. It was documenting missed moments. Cynthia turned another page. I wasn't keeping score. She looked at Aaron. I was trying to understand why we kept missing each other. Aaron whispered, I never knew. I know. 8 years earlier, Aaron came home carrying pizza. I thought we'd take the night off. Cynthia smiled. I'd like that. They ate in the living room, watched half a movie, laughed at scenes neither of them would remember later. It felt normal, comfortable. When the credits rolled, Cynthia quietly picked up the notebook. I met someone today. Aaron looked over. Who? A hospital administrator from Columbia. How'd it go? He said something interesting. Aaron nodded. What? She hesitated. He thinks my idea could actually work. Aaron smiled. That's great. It is. She waited. He looked back at the television. A baseball game had just started. Sin? Yeah? I'm just going to watch the first inning. She smiled. Okay. By the 7th inning, she had gone upstairs. The notebook lay closed on the coffee table. Aaron carried it upstairs before bed. He placed it carefully beside her. He kissed her forehead. She smiled in her sleep. He honestly believed they had shared a wonderful evening. She honestly believed she'd spend another night alone. Neither one was lying. They were simply measuring the marriage by different moments. Back at the reunion, Aaron looked at the notebook again. The dates continued. Ordinary, small, almost forgettable. Except, together, they told a story. Not of betrayal, not of cruelty, but of two people slowly drifting apart while believing everything was mostly fine. Lisa quietly wiped away a tear. I hate this. Daniel looked at her. Why? Because. She laughed softly through the tears. It's so believable. Several classmates nodded. Mr. Bennett folded his hands. Most marriages don't end in one terrible day. He looked around the room. They end in hundreds of ordinary ones. Aaron couldn't take his eyes off the notebook. Did you ever write anything good? Cynthia smiled. Most of it. She turned several pages. Suddenly the handwriting changed. Lighter, happier. She pointed to one entry. Aaron remembered my grandmother's birthday before I did. Another, he drove 3 hours just to fix Dad's porch. Another, he still reaches for my hand every time we cross a parking lot. Aaron stared at the page. You wrote those? I wrote everything. He laughed quietly. I thought. What? I thought the notebook only remembered what I did wrong. She shook her head. It remembered what mattered. Silence settled again. For the first time all evening, Aaron realized something that broke his heart. The notebook had never been collecting evidence against him. It had been protecting memories. Because Cynthia had been afraid that one day they would both forget the life they had actually lived. She slowly closed the notebook. There was only one page I could never bring myself to read again. Aaron looked at her. Which one? She met his eyes. The night you said. She stopped. The sentence we've both remembered differently for 10 years. The ballroom fell silent once more, because everyone knew. They were finally standing at the conversation that had quietly changed 2 lives. No one reached for the coffee. No one checked the time. The reunion had quietly become something else. A room full of classmates sat listening to 2 people slowly discover that neither of them had been telling the same story. Cynthia rested the notebook on the table between them. Her hand stayed on the cover. She didn't open it immediately. Aaron noticed that. She was buying herself courage. I haven't looked at this page in years, she admitted. Mr. Bennett didn't step forward. He stayed exactly where he was. This wasn't his moment. It belonged to them. Cynthia finally opened the notebook. The page was covered with hurried handwriting. Some words had been crossed out. Others had been underlined twice. She looked at the first line, then closed her eyes for a second before speaking. I remember every detail of that evening. 10 years earlier, rain tapped softly against the dining room windows. Aaron's construction estimates covered one end of the table. Cynthia's county maps covered the other. Neither one looked happy. Neither one looked angry. They simply looked exhausted. Aaron rubbed his eyes. Long day? She smiled weakly. The longest. You eat? Eventually. He stood and walked into the kitchen. A minute later, he returned with 2 bowls of leftover soup. She smiled. You remembered. You always forget dinner when you're thinking. She laughed quietly. I probably do. For a few minutes, they simply ate. No tension, no argument, just silence. When they finished, Cynthia turned one of the county maps toward him. I think I'm finally close. Aaron leaned over. What am I looking at? If hospitals shared supplies before emergencies. She pointed across the map. People wouldn't spend hours calling county after county. Aaron studied the lines. He genuinely tried. After a minute, he smiled apologetically. I'm not smart enough to follow all of this. She laughed. You don't have to. I wish I could. You already help. How? You listen. She reached for his hand. I need that more than anything. Aaron squeezed her fingers. Then he looked back at the maps. Sin. She waited. I've been thinking. What about? You keep talking about becoming the woman you think you need to become. She nodded slowly. He looked at her with complete sincerity. I don't think you'll ever become that woman. The room seemed to stop. Aaron continued speaking immediately. You've already passed her. His voice was gentle. You keep chasing someone who doesn't exist. He smiled. I already know the woman I want to spend my life with. Cynthia didn't answer. She stared at him. Aaron mistook her silence for understanding. She mistook his unfinished sentence for doubt. Neither realized the conversation had broken in half. Finally she whispered, I think we're hearing different things. Aaron frowned. What do you mean? She looked down at the notebook. I don't know how to explain it. She quietly stood, picked up the notebook, and walked upstairs. Aaron watched her leave. He honestly believed they simply needed a night's sleep. Back at the reunion, Aaron's face had gone pale. I never. His voice failed him. I never finished. Cynthia nodded. I know that now. He looked at her. Why didn't you stop me? I thought you were finished. And I thought... He gave a broken laugh. You understood. Another long silence settled between them. Then Cynthia slowly turned the notebook around. The page beneath the memory contained something Aaron had never seen. A single sentence written later that same night. I hope I misunderstood him. Aaron stared at it. His chest tightened. She continued turning pages. There were no angry entries after that, only shorter ones, less hopeful, until finally, the writing stopped altogether. The last entry before the divorce simply read, we stopped asking each other what we meant. Aaron covered his mouth. He couldn't speak. Around them, classmates quietly wiped away tears, not because anyone had shouted, because everyone recognized the danger of an unfinished conversation. Mr. Bennett finally spoke. His voice was almost lost beneath the silence. I've taught economics my whole life. He smiled sadly, but the greatest cost I've ever witnessed. He looked at Aaron and Cynthia. Wasn't measured in money. He paused. It was measured in assumptions. No one answered, because there was nothing left to argue about. Only one question remained. If one unfinished sentence had changed both of their lives, what had Cynthia done with the dream Aaron thought had died that night? The ballroom remained quiet long after Mr. Bennett's words faded. The greatest cost was measured in assumptions. No one rushed to change the subject. For several minutes, conversation stayed softer than before, almost thoughtful. The reunion coordinator finally smiled. I think we all deserve a refill. Laughter returned, but gently this time. People drifted toward the coffee station. Others gathered around old photographs again. The evening found its rhythm. Only Aaron couldn't. He watched Cynthia standing alone near one of the ballroom windows. For the first time all night, she wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't helping anyone. She simply looked out across downtown Greenville. Aaron walked over slowly. Mind if I stand here? She smiled. It isn't my window. He laughed quietly. I guess not. For a while, neither of them spoke. It felt strangely familiar, not awkward, just quiet. Aaron finally broke the silence. I realized something. She looked at him. I've spent the entire evening talking about us. He shook his head. I still haven't asked about you. She studied him for a second. No, I haven't. What would you like to know? The question should have been easy. Instead, Aaron realized he didn't know where to begin. He smiled awkwardly. I don't even know the right first question. That made Cynthia laugh. A real laugh. The old Aaron would have started with 20 questions. The old Aaron probably would have. So, what changed? He looked down at the coffee in his hands. I started thinking I already knew the answers. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. I think we both did. 9 years earlier, the apartment was almost empty. A folding table served as a desk. 2 borrowed chairs. 1 lamp. 3 whiteboards leaned against the wall. County maps covered nearly every surface. Cynthia stood alone in the middle of the room. Her first presentation was in less than an hour. She looked at the notebook, then at the tiny audience she expected. 4 hospital administrators, maybe 5. She smiled nervously. I've definitely dreamed bigger audiences. The office door opened. Her friend Maya stepped inside carrying 2 coffees. You rehearsing again? I've only rehearsed 12 times. 12? Maybe 13. Maya handed her a cup. You know. What? If this doesn't work. Cynthia smiled. I'll ask a better question. Maya laughed. I knew you'd say that. No. Cynthia looked toward the notebook. I promised someone I wouldn't stop. You still think about him? Every smile disappeared. Sometimes. You should call. I can't. Why? Because if he really meant what I heard. She looked away. Calling won't change anything. Maya didn't argue. She simply squeezed Cynthia's shoulder before leaving. 30 minutes later, only 3 administrators showed up. 2 left before the presentation ended. 1 stayed. He asked 11 questions. At the end, he smiled. "I don't know whether this works." Cynthia nodded. "I don't either. But I think you're asking the right question. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't success. It was simply the first person willing to keep listening." Back at the reunion, Aaron looked at Cynthia. "Was it hard?" She smiled. "Most days." "You kept going." "I didn't know how to stop." "You never wanted to quit?" She thought for a moment. "I wanted to quit dozens of times." That surprised him. "I almost did." "When?" "The first year." "The second?" She smiled faintly. "The 5th." Aaron looked genuinely confused. "I thought people who changed the world always believed in themselves." She laughed. "I've never met one." Before Aaron could respond, a voice called from across the ballroom. "Cynthia!" She turned. A middle-aged man she'd greeted earlier was hurrying toward her. He looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry to interrupt." "No problem. My wife wanted me to ask." He hesitated. "Our granddaughter starts treatment next week. You mentioned a children's hospital in Asheville." Cynthia nodded. "I did. Would you still be willing to make an introduction?" Without hesitation, she answered, "Of course. I'll send you the information tonight." The man's shoulders visibly relaxed. "You have no idea what that means to our family." Cynthia smiled gently. "I think I do." He thanked her twice before walking away. Aaron watched him disappear into the crowd. No cameras, no applause, no speeches. Just one frightened grandfather, who somehow believed Cynthia could help. Aaron looked back at her, not with admiration, not yet, with curiosity, real curiosity. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the woman he'd divorced. He was looking at the woman he'd never taken the time to know. Aaron watched the grandfather disappear into the crowd. He didn't immediately ask Cynthia what that conversation had been about. A year earlier, he would have, not because he was curious, because he wanted an answer. Tonight felt different. For the first time in years, he wanted to understand before he spoke. "You've helped a lot of people, haven't you?" he asked quietly. Cynthia gave a small smile. "I've worked with a lot of people." "You changed the question." "I did. You didn't answer mine." She laughed. "I've had a lot of practice." Before Aaron could respond, another voice interrupted. "Cynthia?" They turned. It was Dr. Rebecca Langley. She had graduated 3 years ahead of them, and now chaired Greenville Memorial Hospital's charitable foundation. Aaron recognized her immediately. Rebecca smiled warmly. "I almost didn't believe it was you." Cynthia hugged her. "It's been forever." "It really has." Rebecca looked toward Aaron. "Good to see you again." "You too." Rebecca turned back to Cynthia. "I've been meaning to call you." Cynthia laughed. "You've been saying that for 6 months." "I know. I finally have approval." Aaron frowned. "Approval?" Rebecca continued. "The pediatric expansion is moving forward." Cynthia's face brightened. "That's wonderful. We're naming the Family Resource Center next month." She smiled. "I wanted you there." Cynthia shook her head almost immediately. "No." Rebecca looked surprised. "Why not?" "It isn't about me." Rebecca folded her arms. "It never is." Several nearby classmates had begun listening without meaning to. Rebecca smiled knowingly. "You still haven't told anyone, have you?" Cynthia looked almost embarrassed. "There isn't anything to tell." Rebecca laughed. "Cynthia." "There really isn't." Rebecca looked at Aaron. "She's impossible." Aaron smiled politely. "I remember." Rebecca sighed. "Then maybe you remember this too." She looked back at Cynthia. "You never let people know how much you've done." Cynthia answered gently. "The work matters. People matter. My name doesn't." Rebecca smiled. "I've lost that argument for 15 years. She squeezed Cynthia's shoulder before walking away. "I'll expect you next month." I'll think about it. You'll say no. I probably will. Rebecca laughed as she disappeared into the crowd. Aaron stood quietly. He hadn't learned much, only enough to make him wonder even more. 8 years earlier, the first pilot program nearly collapsed. The software failed twice. One hospital withdrew. Funding disappeared. Cynthia sat alone in the tiny office long after everyone else had gone home. The notebook lay open. She stared at a page without writing. Finally, she picked up her pen. Question: if the idea is right, why is it so hard to keep believing in it? She stopped, closed the notebook, rested her forehead against it. A gentle knock came at the door. It was the administrator who had stayed through her first presentation years earlier. You still here? She smiled weakly. I might live here. He laughed. I've got good news. She looked up. We're renewing the pilot. Her eyes widened. I thought the board voted against it. They did. What changed? He smiled. A children's hospital called. They've been quietly using your system. They don't want to lose it. Cynthia sat perfectly still, not celebrating, just breathing. The administrator smiled. You know. What? You've spent years asking the right questions. He paused. I think people are finally starting to answer them. Back at the reunion, Aaron watched Cynthia talking with another former classmate. No introductions, no speeches, just another quiet conversation. He noticed something unusual. 3 different people had approached her in the last 20 minutes. None had asked for money. None had asked for favors. They had asked for guidance, advice, connections, hope. She listened to every one of them exactly the same way she had listened as a teenager sitting beneath the old oak tree. Nothing about her success had changed the way she treated people. If anything, it had made her slower to speak. Aaron looked toward Mr. Bennett. The retired teacher had been watching the room with the contentment of someone seeing former students become the people they'd hoped to be. When Aaron walked over, Mr. Bennett smiled. You've finally stopped looking for answers. Aaron frowned. What do you mean? You're asking better questions now. Aaron looked across the ballroom at Cynthia. I think. He smiled faintly. I'm only about 20 years late. Mr. Bennett chuckled. The important thing isn't when you start. He looked toward Cynthia. It's whether you stop. Before Aaron could reply, the hotel manager hurried into the ballroom. He walked directly toward Cynthia with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry to interrupt. She smiled kindly. It's all right. We've received another call asking whether you're available. Aaron noticed something immediately. The manager wasn't treating her like an ordinary guest. He was treating her with the quiet respect usually reserved for someone whose time carried unusual weight. Cynthia listened, then looked around the ballroom at the people she hadn't seen in a decade. She smiled. Tell them they'll have to wait. The manager nodded, without hesitation. Of course. As he walked away, Aaron found himself asking the question that had never once crossed his mind during their marriage. Just how many lives had Cynthia quietly touched while he wasn't looking? The hotel manager quietly disappeared. No announcement, no explanation. The reunion carried on. Someone started another round of old stories. A few classmates wandered toward the dessert table. The evening looked normal again. Aaron was beginning to understand that this was how Cynthia preferred it. She never made an entrance. She never announced an accomplishment. She simply handled whatever needed handling and returned to the people in front of her. He remembered thinking that trait had made her impossible to read. Now he wondered if it had simply made her humble. The reunion coordinator tapped a spoon against her coffee cup. I've got one last activity before we wrap up. Good-natured groans echoed through the ballroom. No speeches, someone pleaded. I promise. She smiled. When you checked in tonight, everyone received a card. People reached into jacket pockets and purses. I asked each of you to write the name of one classmate who changed your life. Without telling them. Several people smiled. Others looked suddenly emotional. The coordinator continued. We're going to collect them. No names, no explanations. Just the cards. Volunteers passed around small baskets. Within minutes, the cards were stacked on the front table. The coordinator shuffled them. I'll read them one at a time. The first card made everyone laugh. To whoever convinced Coach Simmons that my fake doctor's note was real, thank you. The room erupted. Another card. To the girl who tutored me in algebra without ever making me feel stupid. Someone quietly whispered, "That was probably Cynthia." The coordinator smiled and kept reading. To the boy who fixed my first car for free because he knew my dad had lost his job. Aaron recognized himself immediately. He looked down. He had forgotten that moment completely. Another card. To the teacher who taught me that curiosity was more valuable than certainty. Everyone looked toward Mr. Bennett. The old teacher smiled modestly. Then the coordinator picked up another card. She paused, read it once, then looked up. This one doesn't have a name either. Her voice softened. To the woman whose questions helped save my daughter, even though she'll never know who we are. The room became still. Aaron slowly lifted his head. The coordinator continued reading. The doctors found what everyone else had missed because of a system she refused to give up on. Silence. No one moved. No one laughed. The coordinator quietly set the card down. I don't know who wrote that. Neither did anyone else. Except, across the room, the grandfather who had spoken with Cynthia earlier quietly lowered his eyes. His wife reached for his hand. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Aaron looked toward Cynthia. She seemed almost uncomfortable, as though she wished the card had never been read. Mr. Bennett noticed. He smiled gently. You never wanted recognition. Cynthia shook her head. The family deserved it today. Not me. He nodded. I know. Then he looked around the room. I've spent 40 years watching students become doctors, teachers, soldiers, parents. He smiled toward Cynthia. And every now and then, one quietly changes thousands of lives without ever asking to be remembered. No applause followed. Not because people weren't moved, because applause suddenly felt too small. Aaron found himself staring at Cynthia. He finally understood why she'd never corrected his joke. She hadn't needed anyone in that room to know what she'd accomplished. She had already become exactly the person she'd hoped to be. Not famous, not celebrated, useful. That realization hurt more than embarrassment, because he remembered teasing her about trying to change the world. What he had never understood was that Cynthia had never wanted to change the whole world. She had only wanted to make someone's worst day a little less frightening. And somewhere along the way, without telling anyone, she had. As Aaron looked at her across the ballroom, one final question settled into his mind. Not what had Cynthia built. He was finally beginning to understand that. The question that mattered now was much harder. Why had she spent 10 years making sure no one, including him, ever knew? The ballroom stayed quiet for several long seconds. No one knew what to say after the anonymous card. Not because the words had been dramatic, because they sounded true. The reunion coordinator gently stacked the cards together. I think. She smiled softly. That's a good reminder that we rarely know the full story of the people we once knew. Several classmates nodded. The formal program was over. People began saying their goodbyes. Phone numbers were exchanged. Old friends promised to meet for lunch instead of waiting another 20 years. Aaron didn't move. Across the ballroom, Cynthia was helping volunteers gather empty coffee cups. Even now, with the evening ending, she was making someone else's job easier. He finally walked toward her. Cynthia. She looked up. Hi. Can I ask you something? She smiled. You've been asking better ones tonight. He laughed quietly. I've been trying. She waited. Aaron looked around the nearly empty ballroom before speaking. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? She tilted her head. Tell them what? Everything. She smiled. I don't think I understand. The hospitals. The programs. The people. He shook his head. The life you've built. She looked down at the notebook. When she answered, it was almost a whisper. Because it stopped belonging to me. Aaron frowned. What do you mean? When people started trusting it. She gently rested her hand on the notebook. It wasn't my dream anymore. It became theirs. Erin had expected a different answer. Pride, success, recognition. Instead, she spoke the way she'd spoken at 17. Always about people, never about herself. 7 years earlier, the organization had finally begun growing beyond South Carolina. A national healthcare conference invited Cynthia to receive an innovation award. Her team celebrated. "You have to go," Maya insisted. "You earned this." Cynthia looked at the invitation. "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" "There are 3 hospital directors speaking." "So?" "They built this with me." Maya laughed. "They're introducing you." "I know. So what's the problem?" Cynthia smiled. "I don't want people remembering my name." She looked toward the whiteboard covered with county maps. "If they forget why we started." At the conference, she accepted the award in less than 2 minutes. Instead of talking about herself, she spent almost the entire speech talking about emergency room nurses, paramedics, hospital clerks, volunteer drivers, people whose names never appeared in newspapers. When she stepped off the stage, an elderly physician shook her hand. "I've attended conferences for 40 years. She smiled politely. "Thank you." He nodded toward the audience. "You know why they'll remember you?" She looked surprised. "Why?" "Because you're the only person today who spent more time talking about everyone else." Back at the reunion, Erin slowly nodded. "I think I finally understand." Cynthia smiled gently. "No." He looked at her. "I don't? I don't think anyone ever completely understands another person." She laughed softly. "I've learned that's okay." He smiled. "That sounds like something you'd have written in the notebook." "I probably did." For a moment, they simply stood there. The tension that had followed them all evening had quietly disappeared. Not because every question had been answered, because they had finally started asking them. Mrs. Carter slowly wheeled herself toward them. "I've been waiting all night." Erin smiled. "For what?" She looked at both of them. "To return one last thing." She reached into her purse again. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was an old Polaroid photograph. The edges had faded almost white. Erin immediately recognized it. He and Cynthia stood beneath the old oak tree outside Greenville High. She was laughing. He was pointing at something inside the notebook. Mrs. Carter smiled. "I took this without either of you noticing." Cynthia laughed. "I forgot this existed." "I didn't." The librarian handed it to Erin. "Turn it over." He did. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 words. "Keep asking before assuming you know." Erin stared at the sentence. He looked at Cynthia. "You wrote this?" She smiled. "No." He frowned. "Then who did?" Mrs. Carter folded her hands. "The young man holding the notebook." Erin's eyes widened. "I wrote this." "You did." He searched his memory. Nothing, not even a fragment. He had completely forgotten. Yet somehow, those 6 words had described the very mistake that would one day end his marriage. Erin laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "I guess." He looked at Cynthia. "I should have listened to my younger self." Cynthia smiled. "So should I." The 2 of them laughed together, not because the past no longer hurt, but because, after 10 years, it no longer owned them. Erin turned the faded photograph over one more time. "Keep asking before assuming you know." His own handwriting, his own words, a promise he'd completely forgotten making. He looked at Cynthia and smiled sadly. "It's strange." "What is?" "I spent 10 years thinking I knew exactly how our marriage ended." She nodded. "And?" "I never realized I'd forgotten the man I used to be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ballroom had almost emptied. Volunteers quietly folded tablecloths. Someone rolled away the sound equipment. The reunion was ending. Yet somehow, the most important conversation of the evening had only just begun. Mark wandered over carrying his jacket. "I hate interrupting." He smiled awkwardly. But my wife has been trying to get me out the door for 20 minutes. Aaron laughed. She's probably right. Mark looked at Cynthia. It was good seeing you. You too. Then he looked back at Aaron. You know. He hesitated. I almost told you something earlier. Aaron raised an eyebrow. What? I figured it wasn't my place. What wasn't? Mark looked at Cynthia for permission. She simply shrugged. If you're going to tell him. Tell him the whole thing. Mark nodded. A few years ago, my company almost went under. Aaron looked surprised. You never told me. I didn't tell many people. We'd lost 2 major contracts. The bank was ready to pull our line of credit. Aaron frowned. What happened? I got introduced to someone. He smiled toward Cynthia. Not because she invested. She doesn't do that. Aaron looked confused. Then what? She asked me questions. What kind of questions? The kind nobody at the bank asked. He laughed softly. She spent 2 hours trying to understand the business before she offered a single suggestion. And? She introduced me to 3 people. One became a customer. One became a mentor. The third completely changed our logistics. Aaron blinked. You've never mentioned this. Mark smiled. Because she asked me not to. Aaron slowly turned toward Cynthia. You've been doing things like this. For people you barely know. She smiled. I've been introducing good people to other good people. That's all. Mark laughed. No, that's never all. Just then, Lisa walked back into the ballroom holding her phone. She looked completely stunned. Daniel. Her husband looked up. What? I think. She swallowed. I think I've just figured something out. Several classmates turned toward her. She walked over to Cynthia, holding the phone almost apologetically. I wasn't trying to be rude. I was just curious. Cynthia laughed. I know. Lisa looked around the room. Has anybody here ever heard of something called? She glanced back at the screen. The Bridge Network? Aaron frowned. No. Several classmates shook their heads. Lisa looked at Cynthia again. You founded this? Cynthia sighed softly. I helped. Lisa stared at the screen. It says hospitals in 31 states use it. The room became quiet. It says. She looked up. Millions of patients have benefited. Aaron felt his heartbeat quicken. Lisa kept reading. It also says. She stopped. Her eyes widened. What? Daniel whispered. Lisa looked at Cynthia. It says you still own the majority of the company. Nobody spoke. She looked back at the screen. And. Her voice almost disappeared. Forbes estimates your ownership is worth well over $1 billion. Silence. Absolute silence. Aaron didn't react first. Neither did Mark. Neither did Lisa. Mr. Bennett simply smiled, not proudly, knowingly, as though none of that was the part that mattered. Across the ballroom, Cynthia looked almost embarrassed. She gently lowered Lisa's phone. I've always disliked that headline. Lisa blinked. Why? Because it sounds like the money was the achievement. She looked around the nearly empty room. It wasn't. Aaron stared at her. Then what was? She smiled the same quiet smile he'd fallen in love with 20 years earlier. The first night. She touched the notebook. A hospital called another hospital instead of telling a family there was nothing left they could do. Her eyes became slightly wet. That was the night I felt successful. No one spoke, because, suddenly, $1 billion felt like the smallest part of her story, and Aaron finally understood why she had never corrected his joke. She had never been trying to become a billionaire. She had only kept asking better questions. The rest had simply followed. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute. $1 billion. In any other room, that number would have become the story. Tonight, it somehow wasn't. Aaron looked at Cynthia. then at the old notebook, then back at Cynthia again. Finally, he smiled. I spent 10 years imagining what I'd say if I ever saw you again. She tilted her head. What were you going to say? He laughed softly. Mostly explanations. And now? I don't think explanations matter anymore. She nodded. I agree. He took a slow breath. There is something that matters. She waited. Aaron looked directly into her eyes. The question I should have asked 10 years ago. The ballroom had almost emptied. Only a handful of classmates remained. None of them interrupted. Aaron's voice was quiet. What did you hear me say that night? Cynthia closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them again, they were calm. I heard the man I trusted most tell me that the future I'd spent years dreaming about wasn't worth believing in. Aaron lowered his head. I am so sorry. She gently shook hers. I don't need an apology. He looked surprised. You don't? No. She smiled sadly. I needed that question. He nodded. I know. I've needed it for 10 years. Silence settled between them again. Not painful. Peaceful. For the first time since their divorce, neither of them was trying to defend themselves. They were simply listening. Aaron smiled faintly. My turn? She nodded. I heard your silence. He paused. And I decided it meant you'd already given up on us. Cynthia looked down. I hadn't. I know that now. I was waiting. I was too. They both laughed softly. It was almost unbelievable. Two intelligent people who had spent months waiting for the other person to take the first step. Mr. Bennett quietly walked over. I've been teaching for 42 years. The two of them looked up. I've watched thousands of young people fall in love. He smiled warmly. And I've watched more than a few lose each other. He rested one hand lightly on the notebook. The happiest couples I ever knew weren't the ones who never misunderstood each other. He looked at Aaron. They were the ones humble enough to ask. He turned toward Cynthia. What did you mean? No one said anything, because there wasn't anything left to add. The lesson had already written itself. Aaron reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a fountain pen, the same one he'd carried for years. He held it out towards Cynthia. May I? She looked at the notebook, then handed it to him. Aaron slowly opened it to the very last page. A blank page. The only blank page left. He didn't write immediately. Instead, he looked at Cynthia. What do you think? She smiled. I think this page belongs to both of us. Aaron nodded. Then, in careful handwriting, he wrote just one sentence. Never let one unfinished conversation become the end of your story. He handed her the pen. Without hesitation, Cynthia wrote beneath it. Keep asking one more question. They looked at the page together, not as former husband and wife, not as two people trying to undo the past, but as two people who had finally understood it. Mrs. Carter quietly wiped away a tear. Lisa reached for Daniel's hand. Mark smiled to himself. Mr. Bennett simply looked out across the nearly empty ballroom. 20 years earlier, he taught his students that the quality of their lives would be shaped by the quality of the questions they asked. Tonight, two of those students had finally proven him right. The reunion coordinator called for one last group photograph. Everyone gathered together. Aaron and Cynthia happened to stand side by side, not because fate had reunited them, not because every broken thing had been repaired, but because they no longer needed to stand on opposite sides of the room. The camera flashed. Outside, the evening settled quietly over Greenville. Inside, an old notebook held one final lesson. Dreams can change lives. Success can change circumstances. Money can change opportunities. But sometimes, the question that changes everything is the one we were too afraid to ask. And perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone you love. It's believing you already know their heart before giving them one more chance to explain it. Before you go, I'd love to ask you one question. Have you ever lost someone, not because love disappeared, but because one conversation was never finished? Or maybe you've been the one waiting for the other person to make the first call. If this story reminded you of someone, tell us about it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else reading these comments needs today. And if there's one lesson Cynthia and Aaron taught us, it's this. Never assume you know what someone meant when one more question could change everything. If stories like this speak to your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Golden Thread Stories. Every week, we share heartfelt American stories about love, family, forgiveness, second chances, and the quiet moments that shape our lives. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of the people you love, ask the questions you've been avoiding, and never let pride write the ending to a story that honesty might still rewrite. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next story.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.